So hi, my name's Pete Krutoff. I'm the PTL for the OpenStack UX project, and with me today is Danielle. Danielle, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Danielle Mundele. I am a user research engineer working on user experience in OpenStack. So I work with Pete to do many of the projects that we're going to talk about today.
Awesome. So what we're going to do with this is we don't want the production quality, frankly, to be super high. Instead, we want this to be kind of an informal conversation. So, there's going to be some mistakes. Maybe we're going to forward a slide here and there before we're done talking about it. But I think for the purposes of the community, this is probably the best approach. Um, so let's go ahead and is there anything you want to say on this slide, Danielle?
No, I'm just going to try not to make any mistakes now that you've set that precedent. Oh,
Don't worry, inevitably I'll make more than you do anyway. So let's go ahead and go to the second slide.
I forgot I was controlling it. First mistake. All right, anyways.
So the first thing is we don't have to spend a lot of time here, but I think it is important to sort of emphasize that there does seem to be a fracture within the community around the people that are the actual consumers of OpenStack versus the people that are doing development or upstream development on OpenStack. And the OpenStack UX project is trying to sort of repair that fracture, if you will, and create sort of a feedback loop between the operators as well as feedback loop from the operators to the upstream developers. So you want to go to the next slide, Daniel, or is there anything else you'd want to add?
No.
So the overview is the goal of this presentation is to provide an overview of research that was conducted on behalf of the OpenStack community. Efforts spanned application developers, operators, and architects. And the areas of focus included information needs, quota management, OpenStack client, novice user experience. And I'm sure I missed a few in there. The research areas were selected based on a combination of issues identified in the user survey. The user survey, in particular, had a huge impact on where we decided to do our research because there's a lot of feedback in there from operators. The other thing as well is I do have conversations with operators from time to time, either at the summit or on the phone or via IRC. So I get a pretty good insight into some of the things that they're fighting. Um, for example, we're going to cover quotas. Quotas was very much based on conversations I've had with operators, and there is, of course, the occasional request from a PTL to help understand their project a little bit more. Um, the current focus is on user research, and the reason is that we want to identify specific issues that impact adoption of OpenStack. Um, and that's really kind of a user research area, right? So we're not creating designs, we're trying to understand our customers a little bit better. The other thing is, if you take a look at the user survey, um, they're very good at identifying the what, but not necessarily the why. And what I mean by saying that is, the what is, let's say, for example, the what is deployment. So it is saying, if you read that user survey, we know that deployment's an issue. The problem is that we don't really know why it's a problem. We don't have enough specificity to really identify an issue that can be resolved. Um, Another example is documentation. So documentation is consistently identified as an issue, but when an operator says documentation, is that really what he or she means, or is it, excuse me, boy, is it an information needs problem? So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Danielle.
Yeah, that's where your qualitative research comes in. We got a lot of quantitative data from the survey, so now we'll talk to people and find out why.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the quantity, in a lot of ways, the qualitative data is really the rich stuff that helps provide insight. So it's good that we're
Mm-hmm.
doing it. So what went right over the last 6 months? The team was able to build cadence and conduct 6 studies on behalf of the community. So, typically we do 2 or 3. In this case, we're able to do 6, so roughly once a month. I'd like to get that number up to about one every 3 weeks, but we'll see. Um,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the credit goes to you, Danielle. You were, you know, you were busy plowing along on these studies, and it obviously had a huge impact on the community.
Yeah, well, it was fun. So
So we were able to collaborate with it. We were also able to collaborate with Intel's marketing team to help communicate our efforts. So, you know, I know a bit suspicious because I do work for Intel, but one of the things I do have to say is that the marketing group at Intel OTC was very helpful and doing things to help us communicate. For example, we do now have a graphical user interface guideline or quick start guide that was developed. There's also a persona guideline that was developed that can be printed out. It's currently in a PDF, as well as an enhancing the OpenStack user experience, if you will, booklet, I guess, a report. And again, that's in PDF format that can be downloaded off of the web. In that case, it's very similar to what we're doing right now, which is to kind of give an overview of all the research that was done. Just
yeah, that
happened to
turned
be
out really nice.
yeah, it did turn out really nice, I thought, and it's nice for the individual who may not want to spend the time listening to our video as much as they should. Um, yeah, it's good to go through. So what needs to be improved? Um, I think we need to get better at harvesting user data from the various foundation initiatives, right? So we're currently running hackathons, we're doing operator summits, and we're doing these meetups. And admittedly, the goal for the hackathons really is to teach application developers how to develop for the OpenStack cloud. So that makes complete sense to me. But given that you have, 200 of these people into a room together, right? And a lot of times this is their initial experience writing applications for OpenStack. I think it's a great opportunity to collect data on them as well, or user research data. I think it's also a good place to do some recruitment. So if we're doing a study, say in 6 months, we really should be building up a database of application developers that we can leverage from these different hackathons. Um, in a lot of ways, I think it feels like in the etherpads the data is being collected, but maybe we're not being rigorous or structured enough about how we consume that data.
Mm.
It feels to me at times like this stuff just kind of lives in etherpads. Um, so recruitment continues to be a challenge for us, right? Operators are difficult to recruit. Application developers are nearly impossible. The application developers specifically are a focus for us, but they don't really live within the OpenStack community. And as a result, it's difficult to get at them. But frankly, operators are, and as you, Danielle, you know this, right? Operators in general are difficult to recruit. And fortunately, we have a handful of people that seem to participate in all the studies. We'd like to define contribution to the community to include not just code, frankly, um, but frankly, also your participation in these different user research studies. So
Yeah, and I think as we publicize more our results and get people involved, hopefully there'll be other people that, want to help participate with that.
yeah, and I think we should do some recruitment here at the Barcelona Summit as well to try to pull people in. We'll
Hmm.
see. Um, and this is really a big one. So we also need to get better at collaborating with the different projects to implement the proposed solutions. So as we go through this deck, one of the things you'll see is that there are a number of proposed solutions. Um, convincing the projects to implement those solutions is a bit challenging. I think from our perspective, part of it is we're a very small team, right? So we don't necessarily have the bandwidth to engage the different project PTLs really deeply as well as conduct the research. Um, Not to give that excuse, but I think it is an opportunity to collaborate with the product working group.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
we should track people down better too, I think.
yeah, yeah, we're not really tracking people down very much, and it's getting huge out there. So many different projects, anyways.
That's true.
So the lack of resources to conduct user experience work on the behalf of the community, that's been consistently an issue for us. It seems like companies are willing to give up developers, um, but we're not seeing enough designers and user researchers. I think part of it is design and research is generally pretty limited at these companies anyways, and so they don't necessarily have the scope to focus on the OpenStack community as well. Um, and I would like, this might be controversial. I don't know. I'd really like to see the foundation begin sponsoring initiatives to understand our users. There's a couple of them. There's a couple that, for at least for me, are pretty obvious, which is, supporting an initiative to recruit, or excuse me, well, supporting an initiative to recruit application developers. I think doing an application developer survey once a year would be a good thing, very similar to our user survey that we're currently doing. Um, and the other thing as well is I do think there's some value in doing a um, feature prioritization study. And in that case, what we do is allow the operators to um, look at the different improvements that we could make or the different areas and provide feedback on which ones they feel like we should be working on versus the ones that are maybe less important. So Danielle, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Pete. I think doing having initiatives that help everybody in OpenStack, regardless of what company they're coming from, is definitely going to be helpful. And the research is already out there for anyone to consume, so it would be great to have the foundation support. Um, and yeah, I think we're headed in the right direction, as you mentioned too. I think once we get sort of some of those templates for doing research at certain areas like the hackathons, like we're working on, and engaging people to do research at summits, which we might not attend. I think that'll improve our efforts in that space.
Yep. Yep. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, I guess. So this is
Right.
the cloud operator information needs. So I think this is kind of your area, Danielle.
Yeah. So this is a project that we completed earlier this summer, and I think the goal of this research was to really understand how operators are coming up with these solutions to their problems. There's documentation, obviously, you mentioned before, Pete, is, has been, identified as a thing that needs improvement. But, what exactly is the problem? Is it the documentation? Is it just information in general? So that's what this project was trying to find out, is what kind of information sources are there and how we can improve those for operators. So we spoke to 7 operators. We did interviews with them and just trying to understand their experience and how they find solutions. So asking some questions like what they try first, how they share information, and what are some things that they think would make it easier for them to solve their issues. So listed some main findings here. One thing is that we noticed that a lot of the problems are being tackled through personal knowledge. So operators aren't Googling, immediately the problem every single time. They might have seen a similar problem before and may know how to approach it. Um, but if they need extra advice or need to kind of trigger their memory, a lot of them are using Google and relying on other coworkers or people in the fields that act as their guru to help them try some solutions and get other ideas outside of the box. So typically, these people are sharing information internally, but we don't often see that come back to the OpenStack community. So really, the IRCs and mailing lists, are used, but not so frequently. And we learned that having notes in the code isn't really something that's particularly useful, just because this is a very time-consuming process. So typically when operators are looking in the code, this is in one of their sort of last steps into trying to figure out this very difficult problem. And another thing that we saw potential for improvements were with error messages. So a lot of times the error messages weren't very descriptive, and having more rich information is going to help them figure out what they need to do next or where the problem is to start scoping their issue.
So quick question.
Yeah.
Let's go back to that other slide. Um, did you get kind of, so, later on when we get to the architect information needs, you actually, I noticed like in that last presentation which you gave today, there was like a lot of discussion around sort of tribal knowledge.
Hmm.
Did you notice that there was also sort of a tribal knowledge with the cloud operators as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that I see a commonality is that they're relying on their own knowledge first before they're trying things. But I think, I tend to think that operators are kind of, their own little islands at first. They may be, tasked, they may be the person that's like on call to solve that problem when it comes up. So they're going to try to exhaust all of their personal resources before they engage others. And while the other people are very knowledgeable, I don't know if there's so much sharing per se happening. I know that once there's a solution that is found, that's shared, but I don't think it would be as as reoccurring as maybe some of the desires of the architects to sort of just keep tabs on what people are working on and understand their problems and what solutions they came up with.
Okay. So let's go ahead and go to the. I'm just noticing.
Yeah, no,
Apparently,
me
it's not
too.
going to be 30 minutes. It's going to be an hour.
Could have told you that before, but
Yeah, I
anyway,
know.
so
I know.
recommendations for this, the information needs for operators. So one of the things we learned was that the log is very, it's very helpful, but the log content really doesn't help pinpoint that issue. So having a log entry that could be able to show you where problems are much easier is going to be beneficial because they want that a lot of information, but they don't want to have to sift through it. Also, improving just how information is found. So, a lot of people mention that they just Google things because it will return a multitude of different sources like forums and blogs and OpenStack documentation. So, making sure that if there is a solution out there, that it's turning up there in their search. Another thing that was thought about was to make a knowledge base to share suggested solutions. Um, Again, I don't know if this really serves the group, if operators really in real life would look at the knowledge base in their spare time to help learn, but it could be very beneficial just as a sort of repository for all these problems and the different scenarios in which they were solved, and also have best practices. And this is mostly for issues that are reoccurring or known issues. A couple different ways of solving a problem and uh, details on what that environment looked like is going to be helpful to sort of help people make decisions when they're faced with a issue that comes up.
And it felt like the improved logging was one that frankly really surprised me from the information needs, right? I didn't see it coming at all. Um, but then again, I'm not an operator, right? So I wouldn't know that, I suppose. It's, in my opinion, and I think potentially all four of the bullets are sort of these challenges within the community that are maybe not, I guess if you're a developer, maybe not the sexiest problem in the world to solve,
Mm-hmm.
um, but can potentially have a huge impact. I think, again, to come back to it, improving logging, if you could create a log that somebody can easily triage, um, would go a long way to improving operator experience.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of information included in those logs, so they're very important for being able to figure out what's wrong. So if we can improve that, I think we'll solve a lot of their problems.
Yep.
Oops,
Uh-oh. Who
forgot to
is?
shut off my
Yeah,
forgot to shut off my messages. Sorry.
it's all right. It's all
Oh, it
right.
is shut off. Whatever. Okay, so then following up appropriately, um, we have the infrastructure architect project, which Pete mentioned you just gave and finished today. So this was similar to the operator information needs, but the perspective of the architect is different. So we have these people that are recommending cloud platforms, and they are, looking at which solutions that they're looking to adopt. So they really have a great impact on how the how people are seeing
Mm.
platforms, and if like OpenStack, it may impact its adoption if there's a poor experience there.
Yeah, and we've heard rumors, right? I can't give names. Um, but you do on occasion kind of hear these rumors about these, if you will, infrastructure architects. You could also call them cloud architects or software architects. That they start investigating OpenStack and they do things like try to create, proof of concepts and they really struggle with it. And you can imagine if you're an infrastructure architect and you're having trouble putting together a proof of concept, what's going to happen when you try to go to production scale,
Hmm.
right? And
Right.
and it does turn them off. So
So yeah, we spoke to 5 people. We had consultants, we had people who were on a team within a larger enterprise company. So we had quite a range. And we asked them questions like how the process for recommending a platform looks like, what information is needed, and is there different information needed at various steps? And how do they access the information? And then again, what would make that easier for you? Is there a way that you could find information easier that would help your job? So here's where we really saw this concept of tribal knowledge come to play, in that the architects were more focused on really understanding the solutions that other people had put in place and why and in what environment. So really the type of information that the cloud architects are looking for is that they need to first understand the current environment and the environment that is ideal. So what capabilities that new solution is going to look like. So they need to understand the requirements for those solutions more so than they need to understand what OpenStack actually does. So they're asking questions like, well, we want this specific feature to be supported. Does this certain platform handle that? Or, where's the pros and cons? Should we go with something that meets all of our needs but is difficult to use, or, find something that's a little bit more user friendly but is maybe missing 1 or 2 things that we would have liked? So the research is happening sort of consistently as they're going. There's not really a period of research that happens, maybe in the beginning for a little bit, but as architects talk to more people to understand their needs and perspectives, they're kind of scoping in their head as they're going along. Okay, well, maybe this might not work. Oh, it sounds like they want this, so I think OpenStack might work, etc. So in order to improve their access to information, really having case studies or opinion pieces from other architects, a way for them to communicate what they've done in the past and what works, to expand their knowledge, to enable them to better handle those, coming to those decisions in the future. So a lot of the recommendations were largely surrounded by these communal learning approaches. So having access to other people's opinions. And this could be maybe a forum where they're sharing their ideas, or, a blog or digest to read from. Also having use cases written up about specific scenarios so that they understand, all right, in this certain kind of company that has this size and this need, maybe a solution like this could work, and here's why. And this is mostly also very important for consultants who rely on their breadth of knowledge to recommend a solution. So having as many experiences as possible benefits them. And also having domain specific knowledge. So having more training or certificates geared toward architects, whereas currently, at least in OpenStack, there's mostly an operator focused training, and having more of deeper knowledge about how the cloud is going to actually be used. So understanding how cloud developers deploy their apps in various contexts will help them, the architects, better understand what to recommend.
cool. So do you think, I was thinking about this a little bit, and it might be just me being kind of naive, um, but do you know whether or not we do something that's almost like a training, but the training's really geared towards people that are evaluating OpenStack versus people that are, in production clouds? Do you have any idea? 'Cause I don't know that there's anything like that that really exists right now.
Yeah, I think the only thing that comes to mind is maybe that may have come up at, like local meetups for OpenStack. I know there's an Austin group here that covers various topics, and maybe architects is one. Um, but yeah, I don't
Mhm.
think that there's probably anything formalized.
Yeah, it might be interesting, sort of I don't know what a catchy title would be, but, so now you're looking at OpenStack. What next? Something like that.
Mhm. Right.
Okay, I think that's it.
For this one, yeah.
Um,
Okay, well, I'm on a roll. These are all my projects, like Pete said. I worked on quite a few things. So this one was actually the first project I worked on, and it was centered on understanding new users' experience, in particular using Horizon and doing some tasks there. So it's important to understand the first time use for any product. And we had the opportunity to talk with some students who were in training at OSIC in San Antonio and got their fresh opinions on what they thought of Horizon, which is the user portal to OpenStack. So they did several tasks of involving the process to launch an instance. And we collected several metrics from them. They completed a survey online as they did the tasks in the class. So they were asked how easy was it or hard to complete the task? Did they actually complete it successfully? And what did they like or dislike about the experience? And maybe some areas for improvement. So we found out a few things. Some were expected, and some were a little less so. So there was one particular step in that regarded metadata information. And that process was a little convoluted, especially for someone who hadn't seen it before. Kind of understanding what exactly the metadata was and how it impacted their decisions was definitely something that could have been more clear. There was also a step to reorder the network items in a list. And this wasn't really intuitive because of the way that the GUI looked, that there wasn't really any affordances that told them that they could actually reorder these in the first place. So understanding how we can translate that function better to the first time people who may not realize that's a task, and improving the selection of image and volumes. There were a couple of different methods to go about this, and you know, making things a little bit clearer on that front. And there were a lot of other tasks too that could have benefited by just some simple tweaks to the interface. Some items were too small, some items, went largely unnoticed. And like we said in the nick order, maybe didn't look like there was features there that actually were. So very simple updates would help that out.
so, a couple of other things. So this is actually the new um, create instance workflow in Horizon. Well, not so new anymore. It's at least a year old, but
It's from Mitaka, right? Yeah.
yeah, I think so. And again, it was very, very new for Horizon. And what we sort of found out when we implemented is that there was a few small issues here and there that would actually make a world of difference. So this is one of those classic examples of, we know what the problems are. We just need to spend a little bit of time to fix them, right? And at that point, all is good.
Right, especially from that application developer standpoint.
Yeah, and I think it's what's sort of interesting too in terms of findings was um, I don't know if you're gonna hit on that or not, but what we kind of found too is it's very, very easy when you do development work upstream to assume everybody knows that what you know.
Mhm. Right.
And I think you may have hit on this, but what we sort of found out was, we make a lot of assumptions about the knowledge that newbies have coming in to use OpenStack.
Mhm. Yeah, and
That,
that's why the research is important.
yeah, that's why the research is important. But I think that also, within the community, I think we need to be a little bit better about providing relevant information.
Hmm.
Okay.
Cool. Oops, I think I got off. There we are. So then the recommendations that followed, more clarification for the metadata step within that task. So just a little bit of repositioning the elements on the screen to make things more clear. So following the Gestalt principles of keeping things consistent and grouped together, um, giving more feedback. So kind of showing, more graphical representations if desired, of how your instances and subnets are actually set up, was something that a lot of the participants mentioned. And like we said before, just enhancing some areas. So, maybe clarifying just minor changes. We're going to make improvements, as I mentioned before. Great. So,
Another study.
good for all the people that are still listening to me talk. So the next one was the quota study. This one was scheduled for September, but the timeline got pushed out a little bit, so we just finished this one up earlier this month. And in this research, we really wanted to understand, and this goes back to what Pete said before about understanding that there's a problem, but not really knowing where exactly that problem is pinpointed and why it's a problem in the first place. So we knew that quotas were challenging. And so we have these operational limits that are preventing overuse of cloud resources. So we're trying to understand why managing quotas in a production scale can be difficult and what can improve that experience. So we had interviews with cloud operators. I believe we talked to 8 or 9 people about this, and we asked questions like just understanding their process first. How do they set up new quotas? The project is running, and asking them direct questions like, what's the hardest thing that you have to deal with, and how do you get around that? Are there loopholes in your process, or what does that look like? And then following, what would make it easier to manage quotas? And a lot of people had some really interesting ideas around that. So obviously, people's experiences differed, and there were several different ways of handling quotas. But the main themes that kept resonating with everyone that we spoke to came down to both automating processes, like having an automated process in the case where you're setting up a default project that's just a personal play around with it project. And so any kind of level of automation was seen as beneficial, because that's allowing the operator to focus their time on more pressing issues and not have to deal with some of the minute and often manual changes needed to manage quotas. Also, another theme was to streamline these user requests. So a lot of situations involved ticketing systems. So where the user would bring up a ticket saying, hello, I would like more quota. And so the operator then has to find out all the information, why they need it, how many resources are they using currently, and is this request in line with the work they're doing. So understanding, like having a better way of communicating those needs, and maybe even automating that process itself would also improve quota management. So the recommendations that we pulled from these interviews is that, centralizing the quotas. So making it easy to manage quotas in many different projects. I believe Nova, Neutron, and Cinder, among others, involve quotas, but they're not all handled the same way. So to maybe have that be more consistent across the APIs, to have a consistent model of how quotas are being modified across projects would help. And as well as on the back end, also on the front end, that consistency could be improved. So having a single point of view where you see quotas in multiple projects, and have a clear indication of those statuses. One of the things we heard was that sometimes it was inconsistent between the front and the back end. So having that clarified would definitely help. And also having ways to configure and delegate resources placed mostly on the users, especially in the case where there's a large or hierarchical structure to projects, where an administrator might be managing several projects which have differing needs. Instead of relying on the operator to change the quotas, that the person, the project admin, could decide within their whole quota pool how much to delegate to each mini project at a time.
So, and the thing about the centralize the quotas, it sounds like, at least from what I've heard, that that effort's already on its way, right? I think there's an effort within the community to create sort of a centralized, I don't know what it would be. It's not a toolkit, but something. Um,
Yeah,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
you're right. No, it is. It's with the cross project group. They're working on a delimiter library to, at least sync up those quota in Nova and address the fact that there aren't even quotas in Glance. So we heard from some people that people were getting creative and using Glance, which is a storage solution to actually store images of data to get around their needs there. So yeah, I think definitely that has already started, and from what I have heard, it's going in the right direction, which is encouraging.
Yeah, and it feels like sometimes unfortunately, in fact, some of these cross project initiatives, um, they just seem like they go slowly, unfortunately. Um, and in this case, I did want to add some context, and feel free to interrupt, Danielle, if you had said that I just missed it. The significance of this is, if you have a large deployment in production and you could have up to, 1,000 projects, if you're an operator having to adjust quotas for each of those projects, um, is is just tedious, right? And there needs to be a better way to manage quotas. Is that fair? Is that kind of what you
Right?
heard?
No. Yeah, exactly. I think. Yeah, I think it's one of those boring tasks that operators have to deal with, and as long as this is made easier or automated, I think that solves a lot of the problems.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
All right. So you ready to move on?
Yep. Oh, it's finally a Pete project. I can take a rest.
Yay! So this is a project when Danielle wasn't even around yet, and then I had to do it. So so this is a cloud operator interview. So why does this research matter? And consistency across projects has been identified as an issue in the user survey, right? And everybody should know this. Consistency has been a problem now for, I would imagine it's been floated now for 4 or 5 cycles. Um, and so, the OpenStack client is kind of working to build in some consistency across the APIs. Um, so this was a usability study. It was conducted actually at the OpenStack Austin Summit. So that would have been back in May. Um, and we observed 10 operators as they attempted to perform standard tasks in the OpenStack client. Um, it was, and in fact, the way that the tasks were served up, if you will, to the participants is that we used a survey tool, in this case, SurveyMonkey. And essentially, it would sort of say, you know, go here and log into OpenStack. Here's your username. Here's your password. Then, you would get another instruction that says, we want you to add a user to this project. We want you to create a user and that kind of thing. And as you got done with each of them, um, you had an opportunity to rate that task on a scale of 1 to 5, as well as um, put in some notes around why you did or didn't struggle. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So, the findings were, quick recognition of value. And, This was unprompted. It wasn't, as if we went to operators, and asked them how awesome they thought, the OpenStack client was, or any other kind of way of biasing them. Um, this was something that came out of them relatively unprompted. And, to be frank, I'd never really heard that before from people, running into a study going, oh, yeah, I totally understand what this is for. And I think this is goodness.
Hmm.
Um, there is a lack of commands, right? And that is a potential barrier. Because at some point, if you don't have enough commands or features you can run from the OpenStack client, then what's going to happen is they're going to go back to the project APIs anyways, right? Because at that point, you're having to circumvent different APIs, including the client.
Yeah, you want them to
Um,
have enough value to be
yeah,
able
you
to
do.
actually use it.
That's exactly right, and that is a barrier, right? So it's just adding more commands. Um, and they wanted additional help. And one of the things that we found was they can do context, if you will, context sensitive help, right, to a specific command. It felt to me like they just weren't able to find it. So it's one of those places where the feature existed.
Hmm.
People just weren't discovering it.
Interesting.
You want to go to the next slide? So recommendations pretty straightforward, right? Increase in commands, um, improve the help. In this case, the ability to dive down on detailed help information, um, and better explanations, right? So they felt like, once they did dive down, they didn't get really great explanations of what those commands were. Um, the other thing, in fact, I didn't see this in here. I should have added it. The other thing that we kind of ran into is people were asking for specific examples in the documentation. And I think where they were going with that is, just give me one or two examples that show me how to use the client, and kind of based on that experience, they can kind of figure out what it's all about. So that's kind of it. Do you have any questions for me, Daniel? I know I fly through these things, make a lot of assumptions. So am I
No,
skipping anything?
no, I think that's fair. One of the things that I hear from a lot of these participants is having examples is something that's very valuable to people. I've heard it over multiple different, research projects that we've done, and I think it's valuable to help you kind of have an understanding when you're first getting started with something. So this was maybe one of the first few times that people experienced the OpenStack client.
Mm.
Same with when we looked at the Searchlight function in Horizon. People were really looking for those examples just to know how they could interact with it without spending time, doing trial and error. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a main theme across a lot of OpenStack research we've done.
Isn't that interesting, Danielle? Because I completely agree with you. Is at some point we're starting to see some themes across all of these research initiatives that we're doing, and frankly, as well as the user survey.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in a lot of ways, it's related to sort of cross-project initiatives, right? Where it's a little more difficult to show kind of your progress, I would think, right? Because you don't have a repo, for example, like some of the projects have. Um, and I think a lot of these issues are, I said this earlier, they're non-sexy problems if you're a developer, right? They're things that would go a long ways to improve OpenStack, but it may not include just writing some code. Do you think that's
Right.
fair? Am I going to get beat
No,
up in Barcelona?
I, I know, I do think that's fair. And I think that's why there's still, prevailing issues
Yeah.
that haven't been addressed yet.
Yeah,
So,
and I think but I have to say, of the stuff that we've studied, boy, this OpenStack client, it's like gold, and I wish there was more developers working on it.
hint,
Truly
hint,
do.
plug, plug.
Yeah, hint, hint, plug, plug, based on the feedback we got from operators. Oh, yay, it's one more for Pete. So the
Personas.
OpenStack personas. Yeah, and this is definitely a work in progress. And they should be, frankly, forever. This should be a living document. So why do they matter? I think, especially with as many projects as we have, there's certainly something to be said about having a common, if you will, vernacular. Is that the right word, Danielle? Vernacular for how we talk about our users.
Hmm.
And we currently don't have that. We have a really bad habit of talking about users in the generic, right?
Mhm.
But that's not always helpful. The other thing too is that it also goes to create some empathy for our customers, right? Um, with personas, you may do something that has a negative impact on operators, but you know, you probably wouldn't, or hopefully you wouldn't do something that would have a significant impact on Arnie's, you know,
Right.
job. So the study design, so the personas were actually created from a series of three working sessions. There was two in Austin, one in Seattle. The two in Austin, one was in Rackspace, the other one was over at IBM's Design Center out there. The other one was in Seattle at Best Buy. And contributors included operators, product managers, user researchers from companies like Best Buy, IBM, HP, Intel, and Rackspace. And on top of that, I'd also add architects as well were part of this process. And they were deep dives. They weren't, us meeting for a couple of hours. These were typically 2, 3 day events.
Wow.
Yeah, crazy, huh? So one of the things that we did do is we created what we're referring to as a role ecosystem. And this kind of represents all the potential roles that you can have around, data center all the way to endpoints. And or if you will, data centers all the way to application developers. Um, we only focused on a handful of them, but this is sort of the way, this is kind of what it looks when you look at the roles. And the circles are from the center levels of abstraction. So at the very center, you have your hardware, then you go to your cloud OS, your API endpoints, all the way out to the application level. So let's go to the next slide. I won't spend too much time on this, but we do have 5 personas that we've developed so far. We are planning maybe to add a few more. I'm a little concerned that if we have too many, it gets confusing.
Mhm.
Um, but in this case, obviously application developers are important to us. It's sort of a new focus or well, it's a deeper focus, if you will, for the community because ultimately they're our customers. So we need to make sure that we serve them in an effective manner. Project owners are, they don't really exist in OpenStack yet per se. But the idea around project owners are people that, for example, can add, remove members to their project. They're the ones that may also interface with cloud operations. And, to your point about quotas, they may be the ones that go and ask for more quotas. Not always, but
Yeah.
sometimes.
I was just thinking about that similarity. But go on.
Yeah, yeah. So, and then domain operations. This may be a business unit. This may be within an enterprise. This may be a region. Um, you know, but they have sort of I want to say it's almost like a business relationship to the cloud, right? And they're given, if you will, they're given a slice of the pie, um, and they consume that slice of the pie, right? Hence I don't know if you can even see it, hence the icon where, it's supposed to be a cloud with a little slice out of it. I don't know if that's being
Oh yeah.
communicated effectively. Isn't that nice?
Yeah. I think that's cool.
And then cloud operators, of course, we all know what cloud operators are, and we did talk about infrastructure architects and their information needs as well. We do have some tasks for each of them. I hope to continue to add more tasks for each of these personas. The other thing too is we are currently working on is with the documentation team. What I'd like to do is start tying in some references and hard data to the personas as well because it does exist out there, and it did have a part in formation of the personas. We just haven't done a good enough job of documenting them.
Mm.
So, but love for people to start kind of having these conversations. So model companies, um, and this came from, one of the people that attended the working sessions. And, what he said was it's in some ways hard to talk about personas unless you talk about them in context of the type of company that they work for, right? And, we identified 4 of them, right? Small, medium business, service provider, enterprises, academic, nonprofit. And we did have to generalize. So one word of warning. Otherwise, we would have had 20 companies here, and we decided to land
Yeah.
on 4.
Right.
Um, the what's interesting too is there is a relationship in there. So we do have a small medium business and a service provider, and they do have a relationship because a small medium business may not want to stand up their own cloud or actually invest in hardware infrastructure. So what they're doing is looking to the service provider to provide that. Um, I hate to say it, but similar to AWS, but in this case, this would be a company using OpenStack to provide services. Um, and some of the things we wanted to look at, it was, cloud adoption model. What kind of operations were they doing? Was it internal? Was it external? Was it a service provider? What do their security needs look like? Whether they're using a distro or they're rolling their own, um, and what they need in reliability and compliance as well. So I think, before we move on, the way I would frame this is, as you develop a new feature, think about who your persona is. And then once you do that, you should also land on the type of company that they're working on at, or, consider how that role changes based on, or rather that persona changes based on each of the companies. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. Oh,
Guidelines.
the GUI guidelines. So that's me too. So let's go to the next slide. So why guidelines matter? They matter because, for OpenStack to look like a cohesive product, uh, the graphical user interfaces need to be consistent, right? And you can imagine, if you're an operator and you go into Horizon and it has one graphical user interface, and then you go into ironic, I said ironic, irony there. It's
Oh,
ironic.
whoops.
Yeah. Whoa. So this is what I get for working late. So if you go, for example, in ironic, you don't want that experience to be totally different, right? Because at that point, you're just not looking cohesive. Um, I think so. So as I kind of hammered on, a family look and feel is important. Um, we don't want to force people to have to relearn how to use each of the interfaces. And I think to a large part as well is I think for some of the developers, they don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time thinking about what the interface should look like. So what we're trying to do is create, if you will, a guideline or a patterns library that specifies that, right?
Interesting.
So, yeah, so they can go ahead and adopt it. Now, having said that, it's going to be a little challenging in OpenStack, right? Because people definitely like to have, you know, they like to have some amount of autonomy, I guess is the way I would frame it. So these are just some examples, right? And again, this is a living document, so we have definitely have more stuff that we want to add to it. But in this case, we're talking a little bit about, if you have a modal, where should the cancel button be on your modal? If you have an error, where should that error be placed on the browser window? How do you think about global and local search? I think that's going to be relevant with Searchlight, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
Searchlight is going to have global search, but you also have local search within the page. So how do you think about that?
Right.
Um, things like table actions, row actions, right? So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And some of the other things too is that we're trying to land on standardized icons. Again, at least from my perspective, that should be a relative no-brainer, but much easier for operators if you use the same icons across different products. Wouldn't you agree, Danielle? Or do you take the position that the icons should be extremely different? In fact, that delete and add should be used interchangeably just to mess with the operators a little bit. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't think it's a good idea to mess with any users of any system.
Is that right?
And not just because you're my boss, but I am going to agree with you. I think the consistent icons is a good idea.
You don't think it's a good idea to have a garbage can and then maybe a recycling bin in another one, and then
I just like to have, I don't want to have to think about it. I don't want to have an internal debate with myself on whether something is a garbage can or a trash can or a recycle bin. I just want to know how to get rid of the thing. So I feel like having something consistent helps me
hmm.
just do the task I want to do. So
Okay, good to know. Good feedback, Danielle. I appreciate that.
yeah. Oops, did I hit? Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the
Oh,
GUI guidelines. I think we didn't touch
bonus.
on. Oh, you know what we didn't include, I think, in these slides, but I think they're worth mentioning, which is we also have under the GUI guidelines that talks a little bit about content and text, and things about how when you write a sentence in your modal, should it be a fragment? Should it be a well-formed sentence? Um, There's some other things in there as well that I think are kind of interesting around, the use of acronyms. And I think they also point at a library of common, if you will, terms that are used in OpenStack that should be adopted by each of the teams developing UIs.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I think when we talked with the quotas operators, that really became a problem. Is it a project? Is it a tenant? Having some consistency around that, I think, would definitely benefit.
Yeah, that project tenant thing's classic, right? You hear that over and over again. So
Mm.
let's go to the next slide.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
additional findings.
we kind of forgot Searchlight, didn't we?
We
But
did.
that's fine.
Oh, well,
That's
Searchlight was
okay.
goodness. We do have a presentation though on Searchlight within our YouTube channel, so anybody can go in there. And what I did today as well, Danielle, is I added the links to the presentations to YouTube.
Oh, good.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, in 30 seconds or less, tell me about Searchlight.
Oh, okay.
And there
So
you
this was we did a usability evaluation on a plugin search feature for Horizon called Searchlight. And so what this was, the benefit of this was giving people more comprehensive search. In previous versions of Horizon, you had to pick a filter and it only searched what was on the page. This is a filter based on a search built on Elasticsearch. So this was doing a comprehensive front end and back end search
go.
and making those APIs more consistent. So when people used that, thought it was a very good feature, although it did take a little bit of a learning curve to get used to. Some of the operators did a few searches before they kind of got a hang of how those filters worked. Namely, they were sort of progressive filters that would appear. So they would maybe search for an instance as a type, and then from there they would get instance related filters that would pop up in their field. So getting used to that function. Once they did, though, they thought it was very beneficial and gave them greater flexibility to search. Also included was a full text search, which helped them see any resource and not just one of a particular type. So that definitely cut down on some of the time they would have normally taken to do that search otherwise. And I think similar to the other Horizon research we did, some very small tweaks about how things were presented. Examples was very important. So bringing out the syntax help be an
Oh, you're
improvement.
cutting out a little bit. I'm going to have you go back 30 seconds. Rewind.
Um, so yeah, we had people do different tasks involving search in Horizon, and one of the main benefits was the flexibility they had. So they weren't forced to use a filter. They could do a full text search, which allowed them to see all types of resources associated with a certain term and not one of a particular type.
Yeah.
Uh,
Do you think
Sorry.
it was golden? I mean, do you think what was the overall reaction in your opinion to Searchlight? How did operators feel about it?
I think it was seen as an improvement over the current search in Horizon. I still think there are some improvements to be made that can make it a little bit more intuitive,
Hmm.
especially around the filters. And also, I think a lot of the different, I guess, there was also some sort of steps that required, two searches to figure out. And not sure what the capabilities of the system actually are on a technical standpoint, but there could be some further improvement there in tying your Nova and your Neutron data together in the same search instead of having, a separate API to return that. So,
You know what's
yeah,
interesting too is I think it's I think there are a couple of things. One is it was a great model. It's a great example of how you should be engaging with teams, right? Because the Searchlight folks, Travis, Tier, Matt Borland, they were very engaged through the whole process, including
oh
the
yeah.
design of the survey and all that kind of stuff. I think the other thing was, I got to say, as I recall, Travis was actually submitting bugs almost in real time during your presentation.
Yeah, it was interesting. We piloted it too, where Travis actually and Tier was asking me, the questions, and I was being the participant.
Yeah.
And I think doing that with them definitely ironed out some of the smaller things that would have come up during the actual sessions. And so we
Yeah.
got some of those low hanging fruit.
It's funny because I almost when you say it, they walked you through it, almost made me think of a cognitive walkthrough. Um, and it kind of had me think about that's a tool actually the individual project teams can use, right? Which is it's very rudimentary, but when you're developing a new feature and you want to test it, or if you have something you can test, put together some tasks, have somebody, I wouldn't have somebody on your team volunteer, but I would have somebody, who happens to be an operator volunteer. Give me 1 second.
Oh, bugs. Yeah, no,
Oh, water bug, just 1 second.
and I think that's that's important too. And I think it's easy, like Pete said, to do, and it also forces you, not force, but allows you to think then more about the workflows, and really understand what people are going to be doing instead of just assuming that they might follow one process or another.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm back.
Additional findings?
Bug scared off whoever was at the door. So let's go with the additional findings. These I kind of hesitated to include, but I don't, sometimes you don't know if you're really being controversial or not, Danielle. So this is one of those times. Um, but I think it's worth mentioning. It's something I sort of pulled from the user survey when I took a look at the data. And at times, at least for me, it feels like there's kind of a fracture in terms of why operators like open source projects versus why the upstream contributors like open source. Um,
Hmm.
and I generally don't find that that's really being acknowledged, right? So when I talk to an operator who, is one of your customers, in addition, obviously, to application developers, infrastructure architects, and so on, is, they really value open source because it avoids vendor lock-in, allows them to impact product direction and provide access to code, right? But, they don't, when you talk to them, they don't necessarily talk about things like developer driven communities or anything like that. I think with the operator, another way to maybe to frame it, Danielle, I don't know, let me know if this resonates, but
Hmm.
it's like operators are all about their production environments and keeping those things going. And so the way they value open source is directly related to how it impacts their life, their day, their work day. Um, but it's not, again, I feel like there's a little bit of a disjoint or disconnect in terms of why operators like open source and why upstream contributors like open source, and that we need to kind of reconcile that. I don't know. Do you
Hmm.
agree? Is this controversial? Do you think people are going to be throwing over tables in Barcelona or?
I don't think so, but and I'm also, I'm not as deep in the trenches as you are. So I only am scratching the surface. I'm learning as I'm doing the research too.
Yeah.
Um, so my opinions here are limited
Mm,
based on my understanding of
sure.
some of these things. And
Oh, Danielle's backing out.
well, I don't
So,
know. You said it was controversial. Should I even have an opinion?
you don't want to be associated with this. Okay, I think that's it. Any last words, Danielle, or not? So apparently this is OpenStack user experience in what, 30 minutes or more now is what we should call it.
Yeah, I didn't look at the time, but
I
I
think
bet
we're
it's
hitting
almost
an
an
hour.
hour.
Yeah, I
Yep.
think we're hitting an hour as well. So it'll be interesting to see if anybody listens to this.
Yeah.
They
I'm
should
actually
though. Yeah.
sorry. Well, I'm actually going to give a talk similar to this. Maybe not diving into some of the persona stuff, but I will be talking at the Austin OpenStack meetup next month in November.
Cool.
Just giving a brief overview of the fact that UX exists in OpenStack and, touching on some of the results of the findings that we outlined today.
Cool.
So, yeah,
All right. I think we're all done. Appreciate your help on this, Danielle. And
yeah,
I, in particular, hope the technical committee and the board actually take the time to listen to this. Although it's an hour, I think there's going to be some takeaways that are going to be relevant to maybe some of the decisions they're making.
yeah.
So again,
We can put
yep.
together like a highlight reel.
Yeah. Well, we do have one. It just happens to be PDF form, right?
True.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Have a good evening, Danielle, and
Uh-huh.
talk to you tomorrow.
Yep, sounds great. Bye bye.
Bye.